Calvin Rourke, the elusive ex-CIA operative, had always operated in the shadows. But when his obscure private military contractor, Prometheus Sigma, was linked to a series of devastating attacks on Iran's vital ports, it was clear that his operations were no longer confined to the dark corners of geopolitics. With Israel's military, a rogue faction of the CIA, and international oil magnates involved, Rourke was at the center of a sprawling conspiracy that would reshape the future of global energy and perhaps even push the world into war. The question wasn't who would be blamed, it was who stood to gain from the chaos. On a clear spring morning, three of Iran's largest commercial ports, Bandar Abbas, Bushehr, and Khorramshahr, were engulfed in flames. At 6:42 a.m. local time, a series of massive explosions lit up the horizon, sending plumes of thick black smoke spiraling into the sky. Dockworkers ran for cover as shipping containers were launched into the air like matchsticks. Surveillance footage from nearby buildings captured the chaos. Ships ablaze, fuel lines erupting, and metal structures collapsing under the shockwaves. Within minutes, international news outlets began broadcasting the devastation, labeling it an Israeli military strike in retaliation for Iran's growing weapons supply chain across the region. For many, it seemed like the latest escalation in a long and bitter shadow war. Israeli officials released a brief statement claiming responsibility, stating that the operation targeted facilities believed to be housing advanced missile components en route to proxy militias in Syria and Lebanon. The announcement was concise and unapologetic. Within hours, the global political machine went into motion. Markets dropped, diplomats scrambled, and world leaders called for restraint. The United Nations convened an emergency session while Iran's military mobilized for potential retaliation. The message was clear. Another front in the Middle East had just ignited, but in the midst of the chaos, inconsistencies began to emerge. Satellite imagery released by commercial firms just hours after the attack showed the destruction in detail, and something didn't add up. The port infrastructure was not only bombed, but melted in some areas. Fires burned with unusual intensity, producing odd-colored smoke and leaving strange residue along the shorelines. Experts who analyzed the footage quietly raised red flags. The blast patterns were irregular, as if some of the explosions had come from within the port rather than above. Infrared readings from space suggested areas of extreme heat, unlike anything caused by conventional airstrikes. Iran's own radar systems failed to detect incoming aircraft or missiles prior to the explosions. No drones, no jets, no heat signatures, only the sound of detonations and the wreckage left behind. Civilian. Witnesses described a bright flash in the sky, followed by silence, then chaos, an order of events that contradicted any known form of kinetic attack. Behind closed doors, analysts in Tel Aviv, Washington, and Brussels began quietly asking the same question. If Israel launched the attack, how exactly was it carried out? And if they didn't, who did? What started as a military headline was about to become something much darker. In the days following the strike, international observers began to notice details that didn't fit the official narrative. Military analysts studying the satellite imagery noticed that several of the craters at the port sites were abnormally deep and shaped in ways that didn't match the known blast signatures of Israeli weaponry. Traditional air-to-surface missiles leave predictable impact patterns, yet the damage at Bandar Abbas and Khorramshahr showed radial burn marks and gouges in the earth more consistent with subterranean detonations or internally triggered blasts. In Bushehr, several shipping containers appeared to have been sliced cleanly in half, as if by precision tools, not concussive force. Even more perplexing were the fires. Firefighters and emergency crews who responded to the disaster reported that some of the flames burned with an unusual green-blue hue, suggesting the presence of exotic chemical accelerants. In several areas, water used to fight the blazes turned acidic, corroding fire hoses and burning the skin of first responders. Chemical weapons experts quietly analyzed environmental samples and detected traces of fluorinated compounds, not typically found in military arsenals, raising the possibility that the attack may have involved experimental or banned substances. Yet, no government made an official claim about this. Everyone stayed silent. At the same time, Iran's air defense systems came under scrutiny. Radar logs from early that morning showed no evidence of incoming aircraft, missiles, or drones in the hours before the blasts. The sky had been clear and uneventful. No alarms had sounded, no aerial battles had taken place. Despite Israel claiming responsibility, no flight paths or weapon traces were identified. This was not only unusual, it was unprecedented. In the world of modern warfare, stealth operations are common, but invisible attacks with no heat signature and no propulsion trail defy known military capability. Further complicating the picture were strange anomalies picked up by civilian GPS devices in the area. Fishermen and port workers reported their instruments glitching and recalibrating just before the explosions. Aviation control towers along the Persian Gulf recorded brief disruptions in their navigation systems. These were signs of advanced electronic interference, jamming, spoofing, or worse. Some experts speculated it could have been a cyber attack, or even a space-based weapon system, but nothing could be confirmed. The official story began to crack. Beneath the initial claims of a conventional strike, there was something far more complex unfolding, something far more dangerous, and clearly beyond one country's reach. As investigators sifted through the wreckage and international media speculated on the origins of the attack, another mystery emerged, one that deepened the already growing unease. In the hours leading up to the port explosions, 4 large oil tankers traveling through the Strait of Hormuz disappeared from commercial radar. These vessels, registered under Panamanian, Liberian, and Emirati flags, vanished almost simultaneously, without distress calls, mayday signals, or signs of struggle. The disappearances initially went unnoticed, overshadowed by the chaos at the ports, but within days, satellite tracking companies and maritime analysts began to raise questions. 3 days later, 2 of the missing tankers reappeared, drifting in international waters hundreds of miles from their last known positions. Their hulls were heavily damaged, with massive breaches below the waterline, as though they had been hit from the inside. Crew members were missing, and those found on board appeared disoriented, dehydrated, and unwilling, or unable, to explain what had happened. Black boxes were wiped clean, and navigation logs had been manually disabled. One vessel had been stripped of all cargo. Another carried scorched debris that forensic teams couldn't immediately identify. It wasn't until a recovery operation began that the real shock came. Lodged inside the breached hull of one of the tankers was a strange metallic shard, part of what appeared to be an autonomous drone, unlike anything cataloged by naval defense contractors. It bore no markings, no serial numbers, and was constructed from an alloy blend typically used in stealth aircraft. The object had embedded itself deep in the tanker's structure, suggesting it hadn't struck from the air, but emerged from within or below the ship. This pointed to an attack from the water, perhaps even from inside the cargo area. Maritime analysts began to suspect a coordinated operation involving advanced sabotage technology capable of infiltrating vessels undetected. Some suggested mini-submersibles or drone pods had been launched days in advance and guided into the tankers while docked. The attacks on the ports could then have been timed to destroy any remaining evidence and create a smokescreen for the real operation. If true, this meant someone had gone to extreme lengths to ensure plausible deniability. It wasn't just a military strike. It was a meticulously planned deception, using ghost ships, invisible drones, and missing crews to erase the trail. The question no one could yet answer: who had the capability to do it, and the motive to hide it? While governments scrambled to make sense of the attacks and intelligence agencies traded accusations behind closed doors, a group of investigative journalists working independently uncovered a curious detail buried in leaked procurement records. Among a list of recent military contractors tied to both Israeli and American defense projects was an obscure entity named Prometheus Sigma. On paper, it was a logistics and technology consultancy registered to a P.O. box in the Cayman Islands, with no public-facing website or identifiable leadership. Yet over the past 3 years, Prometheus Sigma had secured over $800 million in classified defense contracts, most of them labeled for emerging threat neutralization and cyberkinetic hybrid operations. Further digging revealed that Prometheus Sigma was anything but a logistics company. Tracing its network of shell companies and subcontractors led to a startling discovery. The firm had deep connections to a former CIA operative named Calvin Rourke, once head of a controversial Black Ops program in South America. Rourke's unit had been disbanded after a covert operation in Venezuela led to civilian casualties and political fallout. Since then, he had disappeared from the intelligence world, only to quietly resurface as the shadowy force behind Prometheus Sigma. Corporate registries linked the firm to research facilities in Israel's Negev desert and private testing grounds in Nevada. The company specialized in integrating AI-driven drones, cyber sabotage platforms, and automated strike capabilities, all technologies capable of performing remote, deniable operations. These were not tools of conventional warfare, but instruments of destabilization, perfectly suited to carry out the kind of attack that had just crippled Iran's port infrastructure. More disturbingly, Prometheus Sigma appeared to be working with no formal oversight. The contracts it received bypassed traditional procurement channels through emergency security exemptions issued during the final months of a prior U.S. administration. Even the Israeli Defense Ministry denied knowledge of the firm's operational roles, despite leaked emails showing high-level meetings between Israeli generals and Sigma's executives. As the pieces came together, a new theory emerged. The port strikes and tanker sabotage may not have been state-sanctioned military actions at all. Instead, they could have been carried out by a private contractor operating in the shadows, using next-generation technology with no fingerprints. If true, it meant the world had just witnessed the first major act of warfare executed not by a nation, but by a corporation. A corporation with no flag, no accountability, and billions to gain. As global attention remained fixated on Iran's next move, a classified leak from within the Israeli intelligence community cast the entire narrative into question. Documents, obtained by a whistleblower, revealed that the Israeli military had only approved a limited cyber operation targeting shipment databases used by Iranian proxies. The plan had been to disable logistical tracking, not destroy infrastructure. There was no official order authorizing physical strikes on port facilities or oil tankers. The explosions, as devastating as they were, had not been sanctioned by Israel's top brass. This revelation sent shockwaves through intelligence circles, suggesting that the attack had been hijacked by another actor operating outside of military command. In Washington, confusion deepened. Internal CIA memos, quietly leaked to independent journalists, hinted at a rogue faction within the agency that had been working off-book for years. This shadow cell had been flagged once before for conducting unauthorized cyber operations in Eastern Europe. Now it appeared they had re-emerged, this time with advanced weapon systems and a corporate partner in Prometheus Sigma. Their motive was becoming clearer: sow chaos, manipulate global energy markets, and push the world closer to conflict, all without leaving a traceable trail. Senior intelligence officials in both Israel and the U.S. began distancing themselves from the operation. Yet when pressed for answers, no agency would publicly confirm or deny their involvement. Behind the scenes, a quiet panic spread. How had an unsanctioned operation been carried out with such precision? Who funded it? And more urgently, what was the endgame? Theories circulated in classified briefings. Perhaps the strike was a false flag, designed to provoke Iran into retaliating and justifying a larger war. Or maybe it was a test, a demonstration of what Prometheus Sigma could offer to the highest bidder. The notion of control began to dissolve. Defense analysts realized they were dealing with a new kind of warfare, one in which power no longer resided solely with nations, but with hybrid actors capable of launching geopolitical disruptions for profit. It was warfare without rules, borders, or oversight. Even seasoned operatives were left reeling. The most alarming realization wasn't just that Prometheus Sigma had bypassed military command. It was that they had done so with ease. With the world's eyes still on Iran, the real threat had slipped through the cracks, hidden behind government seals, black budgets, and corporate facades. As media coverage of the port attacks spiraled into speculation and confusion, a new figure entered the spotlight, reigniting global tensions. In an interview aired on a fringe conservative news channel, former U.S. President Donald Trump made a provocative statement. When asked about the situation in Iran, he said bluntly, "If this blows up, the United States will lead the pack. His words triggered immediate outrage and concern. Although he no longer held office, Trump's comments were seen as signaling support for a broader conflict. Analysts debated whether he was merely offering opinion or referencing privileged information. Behind closed doors in Washington, intelligence officials were already investigating whether members of Trump's former inner circle had maintained contact with Prometheus Sigma. Financial records revealed that several private equity firms tied to former administration advisors had invested in defense startups connected to Sigma's procurement chain. One particular firm had made a significant cash injection just weeks before the Iran attacks. These connections raised red flags, suggesting that individuals once close to the Oval Office may have had foreknowledge of the operation, or worse, a role in shaping it. Further complicating matters, encrypted communications intercepted by European intelligence revealed that a small group of American defense consultants had met with Prometheus Sigma executives in Dubai 2 months prior. The meeting had been disguised as a routine energy security summit. Attendees included former Pentagon contractors, Middle East policy advisors, and retired military officers now working in the private sector. No official records of the discussions were kept, but hotel surveillance footage and flight logs confirmed their presence. Some began to theorize that Trump's statement wasn't just a political flex, but a carefully timed signal to allies and markets. Oil prices surged again within hours of the interview airing. Defense stocks climbed. The timing was too perfect to ignore. Whether intentional or not, Trump's words gave credence to a growing belief. The events in Iran were not a spontaneous military act. They were part of a calculated strategy involving political influence, private interests, and media manipulation. Public reaction was divided. Some viewed Trump's statement as a show of strength. Others saw it as an implicit admission that the attack had been orchestrated, not reactive. In either case, it marked a turning point. What began as an act of war was now looking more like a business operation dressed in geopolitical theater. The lines between statecraft, profit, and power had become dangerously blurred. While military analysts focused on the tactical details of the port attacks, a quieter but far more influential battle was unfolding in the world's financial markets. Within 48 hours of the explosions, global oil prices surged by nearly 18%, the largest spike in over a decade. The closure of Iran's major ports had disrupted a key artery of global energy supply. Tankers were rerouted, shipments delayed, and insurance premiums for operating in the Gulf region skyrocketed. Energy markets, already fragile from geopolitical instability, teetered on the edge of crisis. But for some investors, the chaos was not a disaster. It was a windfall. Data analysts monitoring trading patterns discovered that several hedge funds made massive short-term bets on oil futures just days before the attacks. These funds were tied to a network of private equity groups based in London, New York, and Abu Dhabi. At first, it seemed like fortunate timing, but as patterns emerged, the timing appeared too precise to be coincidental. Some of the largest trades were placed less than 24 hours before the explosions, at volumes that suggested insider knowledge. Regulatory bodies opened quiet investigations, but few were optimistic about holding anyone accountable. Tracing the money led back to Prometheus Sigma. Several board members of companies linked to the firm were also listed as advisors to the same hedge funds that profited most from the oil spike. In essence, the company that had orchestrated or facilitated the attack also stood to benefit financially from the fallout. It was a textbook case of engineered instability. Create a crisis, profit from the panic, but the implications went even further. By destabilizing Iran's ports, global reliance on oil routes controlled by U.S.-aligned nations increased dramatically. Shipments were redirected through Saudi Arabia and the UAE, boosting their influence in OPEC and giving Western oil interests greater leverage in price negotiations. The strategic benefit was clear. Weaken a rival, shift global energy flow, and cash in during the transition. Energy experts now viewed the attack as a deliberate manipulation of the oil economy. It wasn't just about punishing Iran, it was about rebalancing the global power structure around energy. Every barrel delayed, every tanker rerouted, every dollar added to crude prices flowed into the pockets of those who had been preparing for this outcome all along. This wasn't a side effect of war, it was the objective. And in a world run by energy, whoever controls the supply shock controls the future. As investigators continued to peel back the layers behind the port attacks, one conclusion became impossible to ignore. Iran had never been the true target. The physical destruction, the manipulated markets, the geopolitical noise, all of it pointed to a deeper objective: global oil stability. The real goal wasn't to provoke a war with Iran, but to reshape the global energy map in favor of a new alliance built around U.S., Israeli, and Gulf state interests. The port attack served as a catalyst, not a conclusion, in a much broader strategy to shift economic and political power. With Iran's ports crippled, its oil exports were slashed, forcing buyers to seek alternatives. Suddenly, countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia saw surging demand. Meanwhile, the U.S. ramped up shipments of liquefied natural gas to Europe and Asia. The disruption had opened a window of opportunity for these countries to dominate energy, trade routes, and negotiate new deals on their own terms. Iran, isolated and under pressure, was no longer able to leverage its position as a key regional supplier. The blow wasn't just physical, it was economic. Behind this shift were policy architects and corporate stakeholders who had been laying the groundwork for years. Intelligence briefings now revealed that detailed contingency plans for a rapid transition of oil supply chains had existed long before the attacks. These plans involved coordinated infrastructure development in alternate port hubs, fast-tracked maritime security agreements, and pre-approved trade deals, all set to be activated in the event of a Gulf region destabilization event. In other words, the global system had been waiting for a trigger. The port attacks were that trigger. Even more revealing was the behavior of multinational energy corporations. In the days after the explosions, major firms announced sudden expansions, rapid resource deployments, and new shipping corridors. Their speed and confidence suggested foreknowledge. Some had quietly acquired new port rights in the Red Sea region just weeks earlier. Others had diverted tankers in advance of the attacks, as if anticipating chaos. The deeper the investigation went, the more it became clear. Iran had been the stage, not the target. The operation wasn't about retaliation or defense. It was a strategic move to upend global energy dominance. While headlines screamed about war, the architects of the operation were already reaping the rewards. This wasn't a conflict between nations. It was a corporate-driven redirection of global power, executed with military precision and economic ruthlessness. As the investigation deepened, whispers of a larger, more elaborate conspiracy began to surface. A pattern emerged that tied the port attacks, the rogue intelligence operations, and the manipulation of oil markets to a shadowy network of powerful figures, some with connections to both the highest echelons of government and private corporations. It became clear that the attack on Iran's ports wasn't just a corporate power grab. It was the final piece of a far-reaching plan that had been carefully constructed over years. And it wasn't just a few bad actors involved. It was an entire system working in tandem. A hybrid web of influence, capital, and military might. The investigation uncovered a network of former intelligence operatives, corporate executives, and politicians who had quietly been pushing for a major restructuring of the global energy market. These individuals were united by one common goal: to create a new global order where energy was more tightly controlled by a handful of nations and private entities. For years, they had laid the groundwork for such a realignment using backdoor negotiations, shadow lobbying, and under-the-radar investments. They had anticipated crises like the one that unfolded in Iran, crises that would serve as a pivot point to a new economic reality. Their actions were calculated, their timing impeccable. Through a trail of financial documents and off-the-record meetings, journalists uncovered connections between Prometheus Sigma and several international oil magnates. These figures had been working to shift key energy routes and re-establish supply lines that bypassed the Iranian-controlled Strait of Hormuz. They had invested heavily in ports in the Red Sea, East Africa, and even Russia's Arctic region. Future alternatives to the shipping lanes that ran through Iran. This diversification wasn't a spontaneous business decision. It had been a well-timed, preemptive move, designed to ensure that when the inevitable disruption occurred, they would be ready to capitalize on it. It was corporate opportunism of the highest order. But as the pieces fell into place, a chilling revelation emerged. There had been whispers of a larger operation, something beyond just energy manipulation. This was part of a grander strategy to sow long-term instability in the Middle East, ensuring that the U.S. and its allies would retain dominant influence over global oil markets for decades to come. The destruction of Iranian ports was only the first act. The next step was the destabilization of other key players in the region, forcing them to either align with the new order or face isolation. The shadow network behind the attacks understood that instability in the Middle East would lead to a constant state of flux, one that could be controlled by those with the resources to enforce a new global energy architecture. The most chilling part was this: they had already positioned themselves to benefit from the chaos. The attack wasn't just an accident. It was a carefully orchestrated move in a much larger game, and the true consequences were still unfolding. As the dust settled in the wake of the attacks and the global community grappled with the chaos, the true scope of the operation began to unfold in unsettling detail. While governments, energy companies, and financial institutions had been quick to take advantage of the upheaval, one key question still lingered unanswered. Who was pulling the strings behind the scenes? Investigative journalists had already uncovered a complex web of corporations and shadowy intelligence operatives, but what remained hidden was the overarching strategy that tied it all together. In the months following the destruction of Iran's ports, geopolitical tensions in the Middle East reached new heights. While the public focus remained on Iran, the real consequences were felt in global markets, where price manipulation, resource hoarding, and energy dependence began to reach new extremes. Nations that had once relied on Iranian oil and gas were now scrambling for new sources, and the U.S. and its allies, primarily those in the Gulf, moved quickly to fill the void. At the same time, Iran, isolated and economically crippled, found itself unable to leverage its regional power as it had before. This was not the result of a single act of military aggression, but rather the consequence of a meticulously crafted, multi-pronged operation that had been designed to reshape the future of energy. What became clear in the months after the attacks was that the port strikes had been the opening salvo in a much larger game, a game in which energy, not ideology or national security, was the primary currency. Oil, the lifeblood of the global economy, had become the most valuable pawn on the geopolitical chessboard. With Iran's oil exports severely restricted, the power dynamics in the Gulf shifted dramatically. Countries that had previously held opposing views, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the United States, found themselves more aligned than ever, united by a common interest in ensuring the stability of their own energy sources while weakening Iran's position. But there was one more shocking revelation. The role of Prometheus Sigma had not been an isolated one. Investigative teams uncovered evidence of other private military contractors, some with deep ties to governments, others with more obscure and controversial backgrounds, playing a significant role in orchestrating the global response. These firms were not just limited to cyber attacks or logistics. They were directly involved in planning military operations, designing energy infrastructure, and even advising on political maneuvering. They were not merely contractors. They were the architects of the New World Order. As the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, the chilling realization emerged. The world had been manipulated by a shadow network of corporate, intelligence, and military interests, all working in unison to create a new energy regime. The attack on Iran's ports was not just an act of aggression. It was the start of a new phase in a war that had been fought not with bombs and guns, but with market manipulation, cyber warfare, and strategic resource control. What had begun as a regional conflict had evolved into a global struggle, one where the rules of warfare had fundamentally changed, and the true nature of power was now being rewritten. The most dangerous aspect of all? No one was truly in control anymore. Not the governments, not the corporations, and certainly not the people. The world was being reshaped, not by war, but by a cold, calculated reconfiguration of the energy markets that would define the next century.